Hi everybody, Jennifer Schaus here, coming to you live from Washington, D.C. today, and we are kicking off a new webinar series in 2021, which is the GovCon Live Q&A Cafe. So each month we've got 4 panelists who are subject matter experts, and they will each make a short presentation and talk about a specific topic. The series is the second Friday of each month. It is a paid series and it runs from 12 until about 1:30. That'll give us hopefully enough time to answer all of your questions. So if you do have questions, you can type them in on the right-hand side on the panel box, and we will take those in the order that they come in. If there are any questions that we don't have time to address, we'll make sure that the panelists get all of your questions. The recordings are going to be available at the same registration link that you use. So if you paid, then you'll have access to that. If you are not able to make the live presentation, you can still use that same link and pay to get to the recording. The PowerPoints are going to be available at slideshare.net. And here's our schedule. So today, obviously, we're covering cybersecurity and CMMC, a very hot topic. Next month, OTAs, and I'll let you kind of read through the list here. So again, it is the second Friday of each month. We already have our schedule set, as you can see, and our speakers are also set. A little bit about us before we dig into today's presentation. We do provide consulting services for federal contractors. We work with product, service, and software firms, providing anything from market analysis through to compliance, contract administration, contract vehicles, including GSA schedules, and we also help with 8A certification. We want to thank our sponsors. First up is C3 Integrated Solutions. They are a company that helps with CMMC compliance. You can find more out about them at the website listed below, which is the c3isit.com. And I believe we have Bill Wooten on the line today, who is the CEO of the firm, and they've been a great partner and sponsor of our newsletter and webinars throughout the last, I guess, probably year or so. Also want to thank the NVSBC, which is the National Veteran Small Business Coalition. They are a trade association with various chapters across the country, providing networking, matchmaking, and other services for veterans. Their local chapter here in Washington, D.C. is pretty robust, and I recommend it for anyone, even if you're not a veteran. They've got great networking events. And I think one of our panelists may have not muted themselves, so if you guys can keep yourself on mute until we get to your piece, that would be helpful. We also want to thank Set Aside Alert. They are a news publication providing RFP services for small businesses, particularly 8A, veteran-owned, hub zone, and all the other set-aside designations. That's run by Tom Johnson. Last but not least is the Virginia PTAC, and they provide a variety of services for burgeoning businesses that want to enter the federal marketplace, including matchmaking, mentorship, training. They've got some links here to some of the various services that they provide, and they've got a pretty robust group of counselors that work there. So I'd highly recommend working with them and reaching out to them if you can. We want to thank them for putting our events on their calendar as well. And I'm not sure if Chuck has rejoined us, but we do want to thank our speakers for joining us today and putting all the hard work in to make the slides come together as well. Okay, so as we move on, first up is Chuck Brooks with Brooks Consulting. We've also got Jody Reed with McMahon, Welch and Learned. She has spoken at some of our webinars in the past. Susan Ebner, also a frequent speaker in our webinar series. And I think somebody is still perhaps a panelist not on mute. That's Chuck. I'm gonna mute him to help that out. David Dempsey, also a frequent speaker in our webinar series with Dempsey Fontana. And so now we're going to dig into today's topic, which is cybersecurity, CMMC. And I believe First up is going to be Chuck, and hopefully he is, well, actually, I think this is my slide, sorry. So what we're covering today is why CMMC, the Cyber Security Maturity Model Certification, was created. We'll then talk about the basic assessment requirements, the status, and then the rollout issues. And so we'll go through each of those. The speakers will then answer a few questions. And then after that, we will take the questions that everyone is typing in. So again, if you do have questions, please type them in the right-hand side in your control panel under the chat box, and we'll read those off in the order that they come in. So Chuck, you are up, and we'll turn the floor over to you, and just let me know when you're ready for your next slide.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer. No, it's great to be here, and a really important topic. And I think one of the things is why we have this new CMMC is sort of exemplified by the SolarWinds Act, which basically today came out with some information saying that most of the hackers actually guessed the passwords to get into the systems. And some of the passwords were SolarWinds 1, 2, 3. And the fact is that there were 48 different resellers into the government on 204 federal contracts. So that's the tip of the iceberg. But CMC was not devised because of SolarWinds. It came a lot earlier. There was talk both in Homeland Security and DoD going back years to supply chain security. And so what has happened is because of the risk in the supply chain, which they recognized first on weapon systems, DoD decided to basically create a cybersecurity model certification and created levels. And as you can see on slide 1, it basically cites the 5 trust levels of the certification, and it's an approach that will be used for contracts through 2020 to 2026. So they've already actually let a few of these contracts go recently, 15 of them to Air Force, Space Command, Army, and Navy. So it has begun, but it's still a work in process. And next slide, please. So the reason, as I just cited, is why they just established CMMC. Because of examples of primary earlier attacks way before SolarWinds. One was with the United States Navy Operation Sea Dragon. Another was with Chinese hackers and attackers in March 19, where they hit Navy and defense contractors. And then also earlier LinkedIn emails from major defense contract vendors. So this has really been an ongoing problem. So CMC breaches have not, it's not a recent phenomenon. So in order to address a lot of these issues, as I mentioned, the 5 levels of CMC certification, which are basic cyber hygiene, which really explains most of the SolarWinds attack, intermediate cyber hygiene, good cyber hygiene, and proactive, and advanced and progressive cyber. See these 5 levels, as you can see by the chart, are delineated in the description of the processes and the practices necessary. But I'd have to reiterate that they're still being adapted, particularly levels 4 and 5, because of situations and awareness and understanding of new threats and new technologies. Next slide, please. So integrating the solutions for bolstering cybersecurity will include compliant platforms, encrypted assets, data backups, monitoring, and management. And as I mentioned earlier, they've already disclosed some of these contracts. And an interim rule that was formally laid down in December basically creates a dialogue with industry to address some of these interim changes and adapt to them, which will be explained later in the panel by many of the people participating. And actually, I wanted to also point out that the lawmakers have included 9 provisions in the recently passed fiscal 2021 National Defense Authorization Act that will basically look into insights on how DoD will roll out CMMC. So that's a quick summary, and I'll pass it on to the next panelist.
Good morning. I guess good afternoon. I'm here. I had to go on mute. So I'm going to talk about the interim rule that went into effect on November 30th of last year. Mostly just the 2 first new DFARS clauses, because the 3rd new DFARS clause is really very much fundamentally what the rest of the conversation is going to be about. So next slide, please. So as indicated, the DFARS interim rule, when it was issued on September 29th, the effective date was November 30th. So now we have had this in place for basically 1 month. It added 3 new DFARS clauses along with the prescriptive languages. And once the rule became effective, so basically a month ago, DoD was not supposed to award any contracts that did not, that had included the DFARS 252-204-7012 clause if they did not comply with DFARS 252-204-7019. And because that's a very tough thing to say, I'm just going to start talking about the last 4 digits. There is no exception for FAR Part 12 commercial contracts. There is an exception for COTS. Next slide. So basically what the 7019 clause does is it says there's some definitions that would go between basic, medium, and high, and all these come from the NIST SP 800-171, which by now most of us should have heard of. It does talk about covered contractor information, and again, that pulls it from the 7012 clause. Now, just to put a little bit of background in this, we always talk a lot about the 7012 clause, and we don't really mention too much about the 7008 clause. The 7008 clause is the clause that goes into RFPs, and basically what it said was contracts should include the 7012 clause, and that contractors agree by submitting their proposals that they will be compliant with the 7012 clause. The 7012 clause has a slightly different interpretation, slightly different application, so to speak. And basically what it says is that if you are going to get controlled unclassified information, or CUI, then you have to be compliant with the NIST 800-171 clause. These 2 new clauses kind of pick up on that. And the first thing is that if you have the 7012 clause in your contract, you have to have a recent assessment included and uploaded into the Supplier Performance Risk System, which is the SPRS system. However, it does say it's relevant to the offer, and if your contract is not going to include any CUI, arguably the 7012 clause didn't apply, but now you at least have to have your assessment in the system. There was some recently issued frequently asked questions that basically indicated that while you have to have your assessment up and uploaded, you don't actually have to have a CUI compliant system in place. And you can get a basic assessment, which is your self-assessment, simply by doing your own assessment, and you don't actually even have to have a positive assessment. And by the way, the assessment and the questionnaire that comes out can either be a fairly high negative number all the way up to 110, which means that you meet all 800-171 contracts. They've also made it clear that this is a risk issue then for contracting officers to look at and make a decision. So every contractor can go out, do their own self-assessment. There are spreadsheets all over the internet that you can go and do your own self-assessment. You can either, if you have access to the SPRS system, you can upload it yourself. And if you don't have access, there's actually a place that you send it to at the Navy.mil who will upload it for you. And again, you don't actually have any particular score to be awarded a contract. You simply have to have a summary score in the system. The other 2 assessments, the medium and the high, is actually an assessment that is done by the government. And when I say government, I will include in there government contractors, because I'm pretty sure the federal government themselves don't have the resources to do this. But it would be another DoD office. So if we can go to the next slide. So the next slide here, the 7021 clause, basically describes what is done as part to get the assessments. And they're, for the most part, between the medium assessment and the high assessment, they're pretty much the same, except one big difference. To get a high assessment, the government agency or whoever, the DoD agency, whoever it is, comes in and actually bounces what you said you're going to do with what you've actually done. And that's a big difference that's between the medium and the high assessment. The medium assessment, they simply look at all the things you said you were going to do. High assessment, they actually confirm it. The other thing, and this is the part that at least some contractors have had some concern about, is that it does require a contractor to provide access to the facilities, self-assessment, and any documentation. Now, the one good thing that did come out of this is that it's been made very, very clear that any of that information that is out there is to be protected from any FOIA requests, and it is considered to, it is one that falls within one of the exceptions. Next slide. So some potential issues. The biggest issue probably right now is you've been awarded with DFARS Clause 7012 and you haven't performed any assessment of your IT system. And with one of the kind of questions is, does it matter if you've never provided CDI, CUI? And the answer to that is yes, because you still have to have an assessment. The other big issue is that you originally had a contract award date of November 30th. You haven't done any assessments, and now your award date is after November 30th. If your contract has the 7012 clause and you've not managed to get your system up, basically based on this clause, you are no longer eligible for award despite everything else. The other thing is that one of the things that, in listening to some of the commentators and from the government on this, is that under the original 7012 clauses, you could have a POAM, which is basically where you write up how you're going to get to full compliance with 7012, and you never hit the milestone. Instead, you keep changing the date. If that happens and you have data that's going to fall into, that needs to have either a medium or a high assessment, the government is no longer going to approve this, and it's going to put you back into a basic assessment. That's kind of the top 10,000-foot level of these two clauses, and I think we go to the next presenter next.
Hi, everybody. I'm Susan Warshaw-Ebner, and I'm going to talk about the CMMC, the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, what's happening now. Next slide, please. So Jody and Chuck have been talking about what do you have in terms of you're not there, so what is it you expect to do to meet the requirements. So the laydown of the basic assessment Jody mentioned is one where this is what our plan is for getting to compliance. CMMC, on the other hand, is what do you have right now? You're being checked to see, are you compliant? And if you have a contract that's going to include the CMMC requirements in it, that new 252.204.7021 clause, you're also going to see in the solicitation and requirements, here's the level of CMMC that I have to meet to get an award of this contract. And the certification has to occur at the time of award. You can't receive the contract if you're a CMMC contract covered entity. You can't receive that contract unless you actually have been certified at that level. So Chuck mentioned before, there are different levels for CMMC. It all gets a little bit mixed up because we had the 7012 clause, which mandated the 110 requirements of the NIST SP 800-171. And for CMMC, they've added a number of other clauses layered on top of it. And basically, it breaks down to level 1, which is basic, which is, you're just a contractor. You're not expected to be handling CUI. You're at that low level. It's the basic cyber hygiene. If you have the FAR clause, which every contract should have, you've got those 14 or 15 factors that are from SP 800-171 that you have to comply with, plus a little bit more. Level 2 is I'm getting ready to handle CUI. I don't have it yet. It's an intermediate. There's no contract that I expect is going to say level 2 on it. It's either going to say level 1, level 3, level 4, or level 5. Level 3 is I've actually got to handle CUI. CUI is controlled and classified information. It includes both controlled technical information, CTI, as well as CUI, which may be things like identified what are the keys to the kingdom that you are using for performing a contract. I will say this is a huge issue, and I expect to get to be a bigger issue, which is exactly what is COI and what triggers the compliance requirement for a CMMC level, and as well whether you meet that level. So stay tuned, because they're working on COI. The deadline for the agencies to have a website that laid out what their instructions were for COI was December 31 of 2020. We did see DoD put in a COI website. We're seeing other COI instructions out there, but really getting to the heart of what is COI is still not defined. And it's sort of one of those where, on the one hand, some people say the government has to identify if you have COI and tell you what it is. On the other hand, if you're a contractor and you've got a contract, you know you're going to have to use your trade secret information to perform this, or you're generating information in performance of a contract, you may well have COI, which would trigger the requirements for CMMC, or the requirements for handling COI. So this is something to really be paying attention to, and we'll be talking about this in the next few months, because I don't think this is going to go away anytime soon. Levels 4 and 5 are, you've got COI, you've got high level, whether it's a DoD program, something where there's increased levels of security, advanced persistence that you're facing out there. They need you to have a more ratcheted up cybersecurity program. And so levels 4 and 5 are for that situation. Level 5 is really the highest level. That's where you have advanced persistent threats, these APTs, where you've got controls and processes, a repeatable system, one that they can go back, they can measure, and that you really are making changes and addressing things as threats happen. One of the key issues here in terms of what is covered for CMMC, as well as even for basic assessment, is you're certifying your compliance to certain controls for your systems. What's a system really is going to depend on what you identify as the system. There are things where you can be certified at an entire enterprise network level. That's all of your systems. That's actually what the government would prefer. But very often it may not be like the right answer. For example, you're bidding out of a particular cage. A cage code is that entity code for you, for your facility, for the location, what you're going to be working out of. And that may involve different segments or enclaves of computer systems. That's what's going to get certified. If you're going to be performing a contract using multiples, that may raise some questions as well. And as Jody mentioned, basic for CMMC as well, unless you're exclusively providing COTS, meaning you're providing that tube of toothpaste off the shelf, you're not getting any logistics information, you're not doing any modifications, you're not providing services. Those are the only things that are exempt from CMMC right now. And then there's a flow down requirement, which we will talk about next, but the flow down is flowing down that clause to contractors who have CUI and have the 712 clause. Next slide, please. Okay, so thank you. So when we've talked about cybersecurity, we've been seeing this for a number of years now. We did see audits of cybersecurity systems happening through the DCAA. It's called the DBCAC. That's what is conducting these assessments. These are auditors who have training and experience to address these questions on cybersecurity. They also have a team of folks behind them that they use as resources. But now with CMMC, we're moving forward to this third-party assessment vehicle. Frankly, there aren't enough auditors out there to do all of the audits, and having an independent third-party assessment vehicle may be a better, more efficient way to go. At least that's what DoD has been thinking. So they've established the CMMC Advisory Board, CMMC AB, and that is for the whole ball of wax. I'm setting up a system, I'm setting up standards for assessments, I'm conducting training and education, I'm assessing the individuals, and then when they finish assessing, going to DoD to certify that assessment. So the way it's going to work is these things, if you are a Star Wars fanatic like I am, C3PAOs is the name that kind of makes a smile. These are the folks that have the authority when they are certified to go and do the assessments. They have to be accredited. They have to meet all the DoD requirements. They have to meet certain ISO requirements. So only U.S. citizens can be C3 PAOs. They are only authorized or certified to conduct assessments at particular levels. Right now, they're starting out at level 1. In order to be an assessor, they have to be assessed by DoD at level 3 at least, because they'll be dealing with CUI, because even looking at your systems is going to be controlled unclassified information at least at a level 3. So these C3 PAOs are going and they're starting to get accredited, they're starting to be tested, and they will be able to go and do these assessments. Once they do the assessments, there's a protocol, which we'll talk about next slide, but not yet. In addition, one of the issues that we've had, it's been a continuous issue, which is what do we do with these international suppliers and contractors? CMMC has to cover them. The DoD has been engaged in establishing bilateral agreements with other countries. It's been dealing with Israel, England, and some others. So they've already started getting those agreements in place so that assessors who are citizens of that particular country then will be certified so that they can do the CMMC assessment for those particular contractors in those particular countries. How they're going to handle disputes is something that hasn't been resolved yet, but at least they're moving to the direction of at least having some vehicle that assessment at that place. CMMC AB Marketplace is the CMMC AB has established an online marketplace. If you went to their website, you could see listed the entities that currently have gone through some form of process and may have been granted the, the ability to conduct education or training or to be C3 PAOs or assessors at this point. And so the hope is that you as a contractor, you get that CMMC requirement or you're getting ready for CMC, you can have this trusted marketplace. You can identify people who have gone through the vetting process, who DoD and the CMMC AB have determined the all the requirements that are needed to do this assessment, getting ready, reviewing your stuff, and you can pick people there and then go through that process. C3 PAO assessments will be sent to DoD for CMMC certification. So once a C3 PAO assessor goes and does an assessment, assuming that's agreed to by both parties, it goes to DoD, and then DoD would actually do the certification. Those certifications will be valid for 3 years. If you've already had a DIBCAC assessment for level 3, 4, or 5, there is an ability to get grandfathering under the CMMC clause. Next slide. Thanks. So we talked about what do you do if you have an assessment and you don't agree with it. This has been a concern for everybody. C3PO assesses you and you go, you get this result and you were hoping for a level 3 and they say, no, you're a level 2, you haven't met the requirements, you disagree. There is a dispute adjudication process, just the beginnings of it, haven't fully fleshed it out, but the current process would provide, and I expect to see more rules on this in the next couple of months, it would provide for you to submit a dispute adjudication request to the CMMC AB, providing your facts and positions on why it is that you disagree. It's sort of like a protest, except I think you have to have specific details if you're going to be challenging these evaluations. Notably, it also includes ethical lapses. One of the concerns we've had is having CMMC assessors who may have conflicts of interest. They do have to sign a conflict of interest form under the CMMC certification process. But if you have concerns about this, that's part of the adjudication process. The CMMC will follow up, review your request, and they may give a preliminary finding. The plan is that if you still disagree with that finding, they will then provide an additional assessor at no additional cost to go and reassess you. But what happens if you still disagree with that, has not been resolved? My question is, could it be something that you could bring as a protest? Could you raise it as a claim if it's occurring under an existing contract? And where would you protest? So those are questions that have not been resolved yet, but stay tuned because they're working on those. As Chuck mentioned, they're rolling out with CMMC contracts. And I would also note, not just DOD, but GSA and other agencies are putting CMMC in contracts. We have seen the GSA create a CMMC clause and include that in STARS. It's also starting to deal with it and look at it being included in other federal supply schedule contracts. So looking at orders to make sure and see, include a CMMC requirement. Does it include the clause, not only the 7012, but the 7021 clause? Does it lay out a level? These are all questions that if you have an objection to that at the time of bidding or before, those might be protestable things to think about. But DOD rollout, 5-year phased out loud from September, till September 30th, 2025. And CMMC is going to apply where you have the 7012 clause, you have the SAL that requires the CMMC level, unless you have an exclusively contract, and there are flow down requirements. I think next slide is to Dave Dempsey.
I think you're on, there we go.
Yes, I apologize. My name is David Dempsey. I've been talking about the CMMC cyber stuff for quite a while now. And I'm not any smarter now than I was about 2.5 years ago because of the fluidity of this particular subject matter. On the first slide I've got, I'm focusing, the next slide, please. I'm focusing on vocabulary. Do you hear that, Jennifer? Next slide. Okay, thank you. Always like to start out with a little art also, because this is pretty much how I've felt. There are several sources for CMMC vocabulary and cybersecurity vocabulary. A few minutes ago, Susan talked about enclave. That's a defined term in CNSSI, not part of CMMC, not part of the DoD instructions at this stage. The point being that you may have to look to a lot of places to figure out exactly what is required, and more to the point is you may want to make sure that your contracting officer knows the vocabulary and that you all agree on the vocabulary. So what I've done here in these arrows in the last few lines there is essentially picked out terms from CMMC glossary, and I've gone through other sources to find out that an assessment or security control or enabling asset, which are CMMC terms, can also show up in DoD instructions. Throughout NIST, there are many NIST documents that seem to be in play here for a CMC implementation, believe it or not. And then the FIPS, the Federal Information Processing Standards, have two in particular, 200 and 140, where there's problems with definitions there that they don't conflict with CMMC, but they are going to raise a question, particularly for technical people. Now, the reason the sources are relevant is because of this concept of reciprocity, where if you meet a given NIST item under ISO 27001, for example, or the UK requirements, then that will be considered reciprocal to the standard of the NIST, and therefore you pass it. And as a consequence, you can then go ahead and reduce the level of your assessment. The word down there at the almost bottom there, container, that's a defined term. in CMMC, and as a practical matter, that's where you would put all your CUI information if you're going to segregate, which you would be segregating your information because of you've got an enclave. So again, the point is look at the vocabulary and make sure that you know your vocabulary, because this is the vocabulary your assessor is going to be using. On the next slide, I get to a somewhat of a controversy where the CUI, I think Susan accurately described the confusion or the absence of certainty at this stage on what CUI is. I've been through a lot of information and been through a lot of webinars, and at one point the accreditation board was saying that FCI or federal contractor information is not the same as CUI. And if you were to look at the definitions, you'd be scratching your head there trying to figure out what the reason is. The given reason is that federal contractor information, which comes from the FAR clause, is conceptual, relates to a system rather than specific information. However, I've looked at it, and I think for practical purposes, you'd be better off equating federal contractor information with controlled unclassified information for purposes of meeting level 1 and obviously for level 2. And the next issue with CUI is the markings. If you go through the CUI registry, you'll see markings for procurement items, and that'll be a so-called specific CUI marking. And then you go through CTI, which is going to be controlled technical information, and that has relevance to the next CUI marking, which is export control information. And then we get to the next special marking, and that is proprietary information of the contractor, which means that in a response in a proposal, you're going to have the normal FAR marking that says everything here is for government evaluation. That's from Part 15. And you're also going to have to mark pages CUI//SP-ProPin to identify what is your proprietary information. The way you get this is because by definition, you're an authorized holder of CUI. And if you're an authorized holder of CUI and it comes through your system, or you're going to transmit it out of your system, you have a right to designate a particular item, information item, as what's the stand up there, the control technical information, export control, etc. Export control information has a different marking than the CUI marking. So it's going to be export control and it's going to go overseas, and you want to have the ITAR or EAR marking in addition to the CUI marking. When we get down to the DOD's controlled unclassified information instruction 5200.48, you're going to find that they start out by saying, in a sense, ignore all the CUI markings identified by National Archives and Records. These are the ISU markings, because the right that you have with a limited dissemination control marking with the DOD is going to be FedCon, for example, which is federal and contractor. They can look at that information. No foreign is pretty obvious. No con is mean no contractor can look at the information. And then we have distributed the limited only marking. This is from the DOD instruction. So you have to look at both. Now, normally, as you all been told for quite a while now, CUI is not classified information, and that's still correct. But about 2 weeks ago, notice came out where the NISPOM has been put into the Code of Federal Regulations. The NISPOM is the National Industrial Security Program manual, operations manual, excuse me. And in this new 32 CFR, which becomes effective in February, there are references to CUI, and in particular when it's commingled. So as far as the government's going to be concerned, DOD in particular, you're going to have to identify stuff that's classified and information that requires a CUI marking. So on the next slide, we forget about CUI for a minute and talk about other issues. The pilot programs Chuck and Susan have already identified, as they're certainly public. But what I want to focus on is the level 1 assessment guides put out by the Cmc Accreditation Board, because they say some pretty important stuff. One of which is the level 1 assessment criteria are authoritative and provide the assessor what that assessor needs to assess the practice of the contractor. That's level 1. I notice level 1 is only about 58 pages. We're always getting the shorthand analysis, but both level 1 guide and a level 3 guide particularly say that we will let you know how things change when we come out with our next guide. So both are going to change, even though both came out in November. The level 3 assessment guide, again, for certified assessors, they're going to use it to conduct the assessment, level 2 and 3. And the level 2 and 3, this level 3 assessment guide, I believe, is around 400 plus pages, which is sort of similar to the way the original CMMC 1.1 or 1.2 is now. So we have roughly 800 pages of information from CMMC Accreditation Board, or the DOD, however you want to look at it, but it's the Accreditation Board is responsible for these translations of the NIST vocabulary into the CMMC vocabulary. So now you know where to go, finally, to get an idea of what the assessor is going to look at and what you have to be able to provide in the assessment. And that then gets back to what I was talking about earlier with reference to CUI problems, potential problems, and the overall problems associated with vocabulary, and the vocabulary being related to the reciprocity that an assessor is going to be authorized to use to pass you on a given NIST item. Okay, Susan talked about protests, and I'm as puzzled as she is, I think, is probably the best way to sum that up, in the sense that there is no government action that I can think of if you're going to go against the CMMC Accreditation Board. That's not a government party. I don't know what the government, I don't know what GAO is going to say with respect to whether or not that is a protestable forum for anyone to go to if the government is not involved. Now, on subcontractor REAs or claims, again, that requires government action, so that'll be a little easier to identify on whether or not you have a claim or a equitable adjustment to seek. And the only thing that comes to mind there, of course, would be if the level changed during the course of the contract and you had to do something extra that is a requirement of that change. That'd be fairly straightforward. Therefore, I don't anticipate that happening too often, because that would not make sense unless it's peculiar to a specific program. So that is all I can say at this point, and be happy to address some of the other questions as we go through them. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, David. So now we're just going to, we've got about 45 minutes left, so hopefully we can run through some of these questions that we have on the slides, and then we'll start. We do have some questions coming in from the audience, so hopefully we can get through some of these pretty quick. So Chuck, if you can unmute yourself. We've got a question here for you. How will the recent SolarWinds cyber attacks and others impact CMMC thresholds? And Chuck?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Sorry. So I had a Wi-Fi issue. I apologize. My screen locked up totally, so I'm now on a phone, so I can't see it. But it's a really good question. You know, I think what it's, if you look at the process of what's going on now with CMMC, and you look back and you see what sort of happened with FedRAMP, it was sort of a discovery after the fact. They put together forth all these policies and procedures and mechanisms, and then they had to decide, you know, how they function. And that's sort of the same thing that's happening here. It's very complicated, and as you can see, you know, by Susan Jody's and David's presentations, that there's so many moving parts, implications, and reciprocity issues alone that you need to really be guided through this process if you really want to compete on federal contracts at DoD. What's happening now with SolarWinds is they're learning that, you know, first of all, I got to reiterate that it was primarily a cyber hygiene issue that allowed entry to the hackers into a system which basically compromised every federal agency in the government. And so what they're going to do with this now is it's lessons learned, which will probably take about a year at least, because they're probably still in the system. And there's a lot of lateral movement. We don't know all they've done, and they suspect that there's more than one hacking element in it. So we're going to, what the CMC basically is a first step is a vulnerability assessment, and you have to know what's going on. So I think they're going to use what's not in the NIST right now, which is, you know, what is your situation with the implications to asset management, cybersecurity, governance, recovery, especially, and situational awareness issues with the SolarWinds hacked. And I think they're going to implicate, they're going to take some of this information that they derive from the after action report, incident reports that are still going on, and they're going to use this to basically the same way that they're doing with the Pathfinder process with the new contract to see where the process has gaps, and they're going to put these gaps probably up into 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 of those elements of CMMC to see where they fit both to ameliorate a situation, a future simulation with that. But again, I think real world hacks are really the reason for CMMC. And again, we did prepare in a sense for some of the ones that we dealt with, but we you know, the problem is that this is before CMMC has been enacted, and there's just, it's sort of the cat's out of the bag with a lot of the contracting already out there, and it's being taken advantage of it. And this is just one we've discovered. There's probably others. So I think SolarWinds is going to be a guiding force, just like any other large hack would on the government. And I'm reminded of the OMB hack a few years ago, where intelligence sharing was another issue. So there's a lot of problems in after action reports that are going to impact on this.
Okay.
I'd kind of like to add something to that.
Sure.
I think it's kind of interesting because this was a hack of a government system, and when you've got a lot of contractors who rely upon and connect to the government system, it's going to be really interesting to look at and see, okay, so the contractor's done everything they can to protect their system, but then it's connected to a government system in which they're still vulnerable under any one of these various attacks, and arguably then that they're not going to be able to be fully certified. And the reason they're going to not be able to fully certified is going to be because their attachment to the government system versus anything that they have any control over. So that's going to be an interesting thing, especially when you come back to this concept of that they didn't make a certain level, and the only reason they didn't make the level is because they have to be connected to a government system.
Good point.
Great. Okay, in the interest of time, we'll move on here. And Jody, this is gonna go over to you. So you've submitted a proposal that was to be awarded prior to November 30th, but it now has been delayed. Are you still eligible for award?
Well, according to the regulation, the interim regulation, the answer to that is obviously no. However, I think there's going to be some other impacts on there, which is going on to the next questions here, kind of other things to think about, which is, did they actually revise your contract to include the 7019 clause? Do you think the Christian doctrine would write it in? And I'm not so sure it would actually write it in. And then the final thing is it's protestable. I think that if the only reason you were not awarded a contract is because your assessment and you were compliant with 7012, your self-assessment was fine. You may even have be assessed that, if you're at a medium or a high, it's going to be uploaded by the government. But what if they didn't? I think then, yes, I think it's probably a good chance that you might prevail in a protest. But it's also considered an issue of responsibility. And if you can show that you had a certain level and that the only reason that you're not being awarded the contract is because someone in the government didn't upload your assessment, I think you probably are going to win.
Okay, great. Thank you. And we'll move on over to Susan. Has CMMC AB started to certify C3 Baos and assessors?
Right. I mean, I sort of talked about this a little during the discussion. Yes, they have certified. At this point, we've got 11 C3 PAOs that are third-party assessor organizations that are approved by CMMC, but they may only, at this point, assess for level 1 until they do a certain number of assessments, and then they're eligible for consideration for certification for levels 2 and 3. There are only 97 provisional assessors at the last time that I checked the CMMC website to see who's actually been approved to be an assessor. There are 335 registered practitioners. Those are folks that offer consultative services. And then there are 186 registered provider organizations, provide advice, counseling, and recommendations on CMMC. So really not enough people to do all contractors that are anticipated to be covered by CMMC. But as we scale up, I expect that those numbers are going to change. Let's stay tuned.
Okay, great. And David, over to you. If you can unmute yourself, please. Please identify and explain what you consider the foundation for contractor implementation.
I hope it's clear by now that what you want to have is an idea what the scope of your certification is going to be. And that would mean, as a practical matter, identifying a server, or, well, I think server is the best way to keep it at that, where all your CUI is going to be on. And then that server or that item, that piece of hardware, whatever it may be, is what has to go through the assessment process. With FedRAMP, some of the larger contractors are trying to bring in their subcontractors into their FedRAMP cloud protected system. And if that is the case, then that subcontractor is going to have an advantage on whatever that particular cloud coverage will do with respect to certain elements of the NIST requirements, security being the obvious one. Of course, and going back to what Jody just said, a lot of the companies use Microsoft Azure, and Azure is one of the ones that got hit by solar winds pretty hard. So now what do you do? Because the Defense Department has taken a position still that even if your cloud provider fouls up, you're the one who's still responsible. How that will work out in reality, I'm not sure. But the First thing a contractor has to do is identify what they want to have certified, and that will be the, as I've indicated in the vocabulary part, the container or the enclave, et cetera, where the CUI information is going to be held.
I think I jumped ahead there. Super. Okay, and then Chuck, over to you. If you can unmute here for this one. What recommendations do you suggest companies pursue to make themselves more cyber secure? And Chuck, that's yours. If you can unmute.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. I think in the first aspect, I think that from the understanding of what the complications are with CMMC, you definitely need outside help. You cannot go alone. That's the first thing. But in regard to cybersecurity itself, I think the overwhelming theme of the CMMC itself is a cyber hygiene, and most companies don't even follow basic cyber hygiene with password protection, multi-factor authentication. They don't have secure routers, secure Wi-Fi. They don't have, a lot of them don't even have training of employees of how to recognize phishing attacks. So I think companies need to look at the framework that's exemplified by CMMC and apply some of those elements in cyber hygiene programs. And not only will they get themselves better prepared for when they actually do apply and want to be part of the contract, but it's surprisingly, you would think a lot of the vendors in the federal side are already doing this, but they're not. And part of that is because there's a lot of turnover of people. But you know, I think with cyber hygiene in the private sector too, being the primary reason most attacks are done through phishing or done through ransomware attacks the same way, or not changing de facto passwords, and so on appliances and etc. So an IoT issue. So I think cyber hygiene as a starting point is a primary role that every company should undertake even before addressing CMMC.
Great, thank you. Okay, and Susan, over to you here. What level of CMMC must prime contractors require of their subcontractors? Very common question that we get.
Yeah, a common question, and the question is whether there's an answer, and I don't think that there is. So, I mean, if a contract gets a CMMC covered contract with, let's say, level 3, and you've got subcontractors that will be handling CUI, then you'll be flowing down the level 3. On the other hand, the question is whether or not you will have CUI. Dave was talking about difficulties of CUI identification. I talked about a little bit. And so part of it is getting a contracting officer to authorize your flow down of whatever level, if it's going to be something less. And you're really going to have to talk to the contracting officer about it. You're going to have to talk to, I imagine, your subcontractors as well, because as we talked about CUI, there's the CTI, which is the covered technical information that the government may be providing to you, for example. But CUI may be something where you have either technical information or other kinds of information internally or that you're using or generating that's going to trigger that CUI coverage. And so knowing at the subcontractor level what is going to happen is going to be critical to determining what level you flow down. And I'm going to just add in, we talked about that exemption where you have a subcontractor who's providing exclusively COTS products. But if you send them an order and it identifies the contract or it identifies other things logistically or otherwise that may be considered CUI or logistics information that would trigger a higher level of coverage, they then might be subject to CMMC. And so that's something to really be thinking about. Great,
thanks. Okay, and Jody, who is supposed to decide on whether a particular program requires 7012 and the assessment level pursuant to DFARS 7019?
It's supposed to come from the program offices, and it is my understanding there has in fact been some level of training at the various program offices. I do know that one of the concerns is that it's not across the board all program offices. And much like a lot of other things in DoD and in the government, there are going to be some offices that are a lot more sophisticated, and then there's going to be other offices that aren't that sophisticated. I think the contracting officers that I have spoken to, and we've discussed this a little bit, their thought process was, we're going to go ahead and put 7012 in all of our contracts, along with in the RFP the 7018 clause, and then we'll let the statement of works and so forth like that is going to be the place where you're going to see whether something is going to contain CUI, such that you have to be NIST 800-171 compliant. The problem with that, and it's a fairly obvious problem, is that if the contractor doesn't know in advance that their contract is going to have to be compliant with NIST 800-171, it's a little unfair that post-contract award that all of a sudden a program office says, oh yeah, but I've got all this, I'm sending you all this CUI without it ever actually being mentioned prior to contract award. And I view this in a lot of the same way as if this was actually a secure contract. I mean, while this is not classified information, but it's always been up to the government to decide what kinds of information is going to be protected as being classified. And then, of course, it's frequently up to the contractor to implement it. Well, the same thing is here. It's up to the government to tell the contractor what kinds of information it's going to consider to be controlled unclassified information and what kinds of information it doesn't. And then it will be obviously up to the contractor to implement its whatever. But they have to do this during the RFP phase. They cannot do this after the RFP phase. Now, when we start talking about the big contractors, it's probably not a big deal because all of them are going to be probably heading off to trying to be CMMC level 5. But when you start talking about a 2 or 3 person small contractor, it's going to cause problems for them, I think.
Okay, great. And our next question, back over to David. Will CMMC level 2 be used between now and fiscal year 2025?
Right now, the level 2 has always been referred to as the transitional phase. And as we know, level 1 is 17 NIST items, and level 3 is 130 NIST items, with level 2 being 75. So to go from 17 to 130 strikes me as politely short-sighted, and it does also underscore something that Jody and Susan have indicated. The thing that I'm quite saying that I'm about to is there seems to be a gap between cybersecurity and procurement. You're trying to get the contractor to take care of the data, fair enough, but it doesn't quite fit into the procurement system to do that. And NARA, or National Archives, are putting together their markings for, excuse me, for for the government. Obviously, they had something for cost of data and that sort of thing. But they didn't quite have anything for privacy, PII, which is the personal information, which can be relevant when you want to know who the program manager is going to be, and their background is a big part of the source selection. So I am hoping, I haven't looked at the comments yet on the latest clauses, etc., but I'm hoping that level 2 will be implemented. And the reason for that is because the contracting office much more leeway with respect to what they're going to consider CUI and the protection of it. So again, the basic gap between level 1 and level 3 is so extreme that it only makes sense to enable the procurement process to use something else, which would be level 2 in those 75 items. And again, that will get back again reciprocity I talked about earlier, whether or not you already qualify for several things, whether you're going to be used the cloud that a particular prime will let you in on, and whether or not you want to identify your enclave for your container in such a way that you can get to level 2 a lot faster than it would seem like you can if you go from level 1 to level 3 with the attendant costs associated with it.
Okay, great. And I think this now takes us over to our live questions. So again, if you do have any questions, please type them into the dialog box in the right-hand side. And I'm actually going to move to the next slide that has our the contact information. So if you guys want to reach out to anybody after the presentation, you're welcome to. But I'm going to start at the top here. So we may have covered some of these earlier questions. And I'm going to read one off here, which is, could you please expand upon the echelons of subcontractors and how you determine what level they should have? And I think perhaps that was covered in Susan's questions about subcontractors, but if you just want to recap that briefly, Susan.
Yeah, I mean, I think at this point, what we can say is if you're buying commercial off-the-shelf things, you know, that may be somebody who's not going to have COI. There actually is a lot of discussion, you know, in terms of if you're buying from manufacturers, whether or not the manufacturers are going to have COI just because of the manufacturing systems. So I think, you know, services providers, obviously, it depends on what kind of services they're doing. Are they using systems? Somebody like a landscaper may not be somebody who you're going to foresee is going to need a higher level Cmc certification. On the other hand, you're learning data services and you're hiring somebody to be the maintenance person or to operate the switching stations or whatever. You could see they might have even higher levels of certification. So I think it's going to depend on, you know, case by case as to what it is that they're doing as to what level they're going to be found. So I think most important thing is to try and get those things sorted out before you go and you propose. Maybe there'll be an opportunity for asking questions during procurements. I could see this really critical to try and assess if you get a CMMC covered solution, asking questions about what they view as the levels for the kinds of subcontracts that are anticipated. But otherwise, I think you're going to have to work really hard with your subs to make sure that you're clarifying what they're going to have and do, and then work with the contracting office to get those established levels. Some agencies, like the Department of Navy, actually has a pretty good system set up. They have legal counsel, technical folks for assessing levels already set up so that when these questions come in, they can address those kinds of questions. But other agencies are not as up to speed. So I think it's really going to depend on the DoD agency or other agencies and what it is in particular. Sorry, that's about all I have.
Okay,
It's good.
great. And the next question is, are there or will there be CMMC grant money from Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, CMMC? So basically looking for CMMC grant money. Any thoughts, anybody?
I mean,
Oh, one thing we do know is,
Dave, otherwise I will.
Maybe Jody?
one thing we do know is that the cost of becoming CMMC compliant is an allowable expense. Whether there's going to be specific grant money coming down is still up for grabs. I do know in talking with various clients that some of the state organizations that help small businesses has been giving some grants for cybersecurity to small businesses, not specifically to CMMC, but just in general. They just have to meet certain requirements. I know that Virginia has a program because I've talked about it with one of my clients. So the potential is there, but I think part of the problem is if you look at it from the perspective of everything's been happening with COVID-19 and everything else, a lot of the discretionary money that the agencies would maybe have had to implement the CMMC is probably not as available as it would have been otherwise. But you can always go on to the government's grant page and look and see if from the different agencies, whether they do have some money available, but my guess is going to be it's not going to be CMMC compliance. Specifically, it's probably going to be a more generic cybersecurity grant.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I would add, let me just add to that, that I'm sort of kind of channeling Katie Arrington over here, who is the DoD CISO, and she's taken the position that with regard to like the 800-170 requirements, if you haven't done it already, she's not giving money that, she's not planning that's going to be something that's going to get paid for. But with regard to these new CMMC levels, and as Jody mentioned, the PTACs are going to be talking about that. But in addition to what Jody said, a lot of the large government contractors are setting up systems so that they can actually work with their subcontractors to help them achieve those levels. So in addition to checking Jody's sites, if you are a sub or potential sub for one of the larger, mid-size or higher level government contractors, I would talk to them and see what they're willing to do to help you get up to speed or put your system on.
Okay, great. And our next question is, could a dispute potentially keep you from bidding or being awarded a contract? Susan, Jody, David, Chuck, anybody for that one?
Well, that's
David?
not quite the clear question I'd be looking for. If they're talking about if the dispute will keep you from bidding, the answer would be no. But if you talking about if you're in dispute and you have a question and you asked or didn't ask, then you're going to have a different response, different answer, which is that would likely keep you from being a successful contractor for that particular proposal. That's about all I can contribute to that.
Okay. Jody, were you going to say something?
I was just going to say, I think you'd have to know what the dispute was. I mean, if the dispute is whether or not you are a certain level of cybersecurity compliant or CMMC compliant, and they want you to be at 4 and you're being assessed at 2, it's probably going to stop you from getting a contract. But a general dispute, it shouldn't have any effect at all on whether or not you're awarded a contract.
Okay, great. And our next question is, how do you become a certified assessor?
Go to AB school.
So the way to be a certified assessor is, go to the CMMCB website, and there's a link that you can click on to apply, and you'll find all the information out about levels of assessor and applying for that.
Okay. Our next question, and these are all anonymous, so please feel free to ask anything. Please offer some suggestions for most cost and time efficient method for small businesses to handle ongoing requirements of CMMC. Chuck, David, Jody,
I think that
Susan?
the real trick is to find somebody who is, can you hear me?
Yes.
I can't tell you. Can you hear me? I was going to say, I think one thing for small businesses is to find somebody who's an approved give something advice and to a contract with them, you know, have them work with you to put your system up to speed, and have some kind of contract that'll keep working. And there are going to be more challenges, you know, whether it's a hack or that else has, or that God forbid you have to kind of keep up.
Okay. And Chuck, did you have something to add here, Chuck? Maybe not.
I did.
Okay.
I've got something to add to that one, which would be go Google Project Spectrum and go to that site. And they at one point talked about providing a list of managed service providers, just to find to do exactly what Susan described. Somebody outside, and as Chuck said in the very beginning, you can't do it by yourself. Find that company or individual, and then talk to them and find out if they can do it. But if Project Spectrum has not put a list up, then I would get in contact with them and ask them, what do they think? I don't know, maybe Susan does, but I don't know if the accreditation board website has a list of the applicants to be a registered provider, or however you want to describe them. I think they're just going to put a list of the people who have successfully gotten their assessment education and their license, if you will, to go ahead and do the assessments.
Great. Okay.
Yeah, I would
The
totally
answer
agree
is
with
that
okay.
they don't have, go ahead. Chuck trying to say something?
Oh no, I was just agreeing with
go ahead, Chuck.
David. I think
Chuck,
that
were you trying to say something?
Yeah, you cannot do this alone. I agree with what David just said, particularly with legal and liability implications. So I would recommend for any small business, even with cybersecurity basics, to look to outsource because it's going to impact their operation if they look to try and do this and probably deny them contracts. So it's penny wise and pound foolish not to use outside help.
Great.
Yeah, I mean, this
I would like to add,
CMC website does have registered providers on it, but it doesn't have the applicants, Dave, to your point of there are folks who have applied, they haven't yet gotten it yet, so it's got to be updated.
Okay, great.
I was on a panel a little while ago, and my understanding is just that while there has been some individuals who have been approved, the companies themselves have not been approved at this point. So I would caution everyone to be very careful when you get somebody that you do confirm that at least the individual that they're bringing there has been approved. And I'd also point out that that Cmc, the board, is doing a presentation on, I want to say the 26th in the evening, that if you're part of their thing that they've sent out, it's up to 3,000 people can sign in on this. So I'm pretty sure there's going to be some more updates coming in from that.
Okay, great. And our next question reads, is a container a repository for CUI information that's gathered during an assessment?
It's not gathered during the assessment. It's what the assessment evaluates for purposes of whether it meets the various NIST requirements or the CMMC requirements.
Okay, great. And the next question, I'm just reading it verbatim here. Recommend software utilized. With the question mark. So
to my knowledge, Project Spectrum has taken on that request also. I haven't been to their website recently, i.e. not since yesterday, and I didn't see anything there where they had that list up yet. That's another thing they are indicated they would try to do.
okay, great. And our last question, which looks like is a repeat from a different person from earlier, where should I go to become an assessor? And
Yeah, again, that's the CMMC website, go to the cmmcab.org website, and I can find it there. I would just kind of follow up on Dave's point, which is having a set of software is not going to be enough to ensure that you're compliant, nor is going onto a cloud, because there are issues of connectivity as well as, what's the information when it transits. And so I really think people need to be thinking about this in terms of who can they use that really has this experience to help them. Like yourself, I've heard I can't remember his name, the guy from DCAA talk and say, I set up my own system and it only cost me so many hundreds of dollars. He actually knows what he's saying. And so the issue is, what have you got and how do you have to handle it?
Okay, great. And I think that wraps up our questions. So last call for questions. Otherwise, I want to thank again all of our sponsors, as well as our speakers, Chuck Brooks, Susan Warshaw-Ebner, David Dempsey, Jody Reed. Fantastic job, lots of great information. Obviously, a lot of moving parts here. So we will we'll send out the recording to those who have registered and paid for the webinar today. And again, join us next month. This series is the second Friday of every month, 12 o'clock. It'll follow the same format, which again is a short presentation. And we do have one more question that came in. It was just thank you for the presentation. Okay, you're welcome and thank you. So every month we'll feature a new topic. Next month, we're talking about OTAs, other transaction authorities. March, I believe we cover bid protests, so feel free to sign up, and we look forward to seeing you then. And also, thanks again to our great panelists. Great to virtually see you guys. Hopefully at some point this year, we can all grab a coffee. But I appreciate your time, your input and effort and energy that went into putting today's program together. So thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you. Glad
Stay
that
safe,
helped.
everybody.
Thank you. It's our pleasure.
Bye.